Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining tonight's program. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History, which is the collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. And I would like to thank you all for joining the program this evening. If you'd like to view the automated live captions and you're not currently seeing them, you can just click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Some other housekeeping stuff, the chat is disabled for participants, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. No need to raise your hand, and we'll get to questions at the end, but feel free to type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded. If you registered for the program, you'll get an email with a link to the recording within a couple of weeks. Our plan for tonight is our speakers will have a conversation, and then we will take some questions from you, and we hope to wrap it up in about an hour. The book under discussion tonight is the latest title from the Jewish Lives series, which is a partnership of Yale University Press and the Leon D. Black Foundation. Jewish Lives is a prize-winning series of biographies designed to explore the many facets of Jewish identity with individual volumes that illuminate Jewish figures from all walks of life and throughout history. So let me introduce our speakers tonight. Dr. Daniel Matt is a scholar of Kabbalah and the Zohar. He has been featured in Time and Newsweek and has appeared on National Public Radio and the History Channel. He has published over a dozen books, including The Essential Kabbalah, translated into 8 languages, Zohar, Annotated and Explained, and God and the Big Bang, Discovering Harmony Between Science and Spirituality. His biography of Elijah the Prophet, Becoming Elijah, Prophet of Transformation, which he'll be discussing tonight, comes out on March 15th from Yale University Press in the Jewish Lives series. You should already have received a link with a code for 25% off plus free shipping in your reminder email, but I will also put that in the chat during tonight's program as well. Some years ago, Dr. Matt completed an 18-year project of translating and annotating the Zohar. In 2016, Stanford University Press published his 9th volume of the Zohar Pritzker edition, concluding the Zohar's main commentary on the Torah. For this work, he has been honored with the National Jewish Book Award and a Koret Jewish Book Award. Dr. Matt received his PhD from Brandeis University and for 20 years served as professor at the Center for Jewish Studies at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He has also taught at Stanford University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He lives in Berkeley with his wife, Hannah, and currently teaches Zohar online. He will be in conversation with Dr. Barry Holtz, who is the Theodore and Florence Baumritter Professor of Jewish Education at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. From 2008 to 2013, he served as the Dean of the seminary's William Davidson Graduate School of Jewish Education. Earlier in his career, Dr. Holtz spent 12 years as co-director of the seminary's Melton Research Center for Jewish Education. As author and editor, Professor Holtz's books include Back to the Sources, Reading the Classic Jewish Texts, A Guide to Reading and Appreciating the Great Jewish Books, Finding Our Way, Jewish Texts and the Lives We Lead Today, and Textual Knowledge, Teaching the Bible in Theory and in Practice, which received the National Jewish Book Award for Education in 2004. His most recent book is Rabbi Akiva, Sage of the Talmud, which was also part of the Jewish Lives series of Yale University Press. So I'd like to thank you both for being here. I'll let you have your conversation and I will come back in a little while for the Q&A.
Thank you, Lauren. So here we are, Daniel. We've known each other for a long time, but this is an interesting kind of forum for us to talk with one another. Before I ask you the first question about the book, I want to say to all of the people here in the program, which now I see is over 200 people, which is fantastic, that just to repeat something I said to you privately, this is a terrific book. I highly recommend it. And I think what's really extraordinary about the book, it's very deeply based on scholarship, but it is a book that is accessible to the general reader. And what you've done here is hit that sweet spot, which is not so easy to hit, between doing something really deep and really something substantive, and at the same time making it available to a general reader while you're not talking down to the reader. Often, as I had said to you, when scholars write for a popular audience, they kind of get into this overly jokey or overly whatever, too familiar kind of tone. And this book is very respectful of the reader, and at the same time lets the reader in. So Mazel Tov, it's a really wonderful accomplishment. So let's begin. Elijah the prophet, his entire story is told in 7 chapters of the Bible. And you've written a whole book about it. So let's begin with this Elijah in the Bible and then see what you do with Elijah after the Bible. So I suppose the place to begin is, where did he come from? What do we know about the origins of this really legendary figure?
Yeah, so much about Elijah is unknown and mysterious. That's kind of fitting. We don't know that much about a number of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible, but we know something. With Elijah, we don't hear anything about his first call. We don't hear anything about his birth. We don't know who his parents were. We don't know if he was married. We don't know if he had children. He seems to be very much of a loner, which is strange because Elijah eventually becomes such a part of the Jewish family. If you think of, sure, people think immediately of the Seder. What could be a more familial event than the Seder or circumcision or Havdalah? Elijah is there with the family, but in the Bible, he is off on his own, wandering. He seems to be filled with the Spirit, but the Spirit can take him off, can take him away. It's a beautiful line in the book of Kings where King Ahab's servant meets Elijah, and his name is Obadiah, and Obadiah says to Elijah, "V'ruach Adonai yisa'acha al asher lo eda." The Ruach of God, the Spirit of God, the wind of God will carry you off to I don't know where. So it's very hard to pin him down. And in fact, the first time he's mentioned in the book of Kings, he just seems to appear out of nowhere. It just says Elijah confronted King Ahab. So he appears mysteriously, he disappears mysteriously. And as you say, there are only 7 chapters in the Bible, although a lot is packed into those chapters. Yeah. And then Elijah really takes on, an eternal career, what I call his post-biblical career. In fact, I remember when I was initially talking to Jewish Lives about this project, I said to them, Elijah is really the most fitting person for Jewish Lives because it's lives in the plural. And Elijah seems to have a few of them.
So you mentioned King Ahab, and for the benefit of the folks on the program, why don't you give us a little background on I guess you call it the political situation in Israel, and this particular king and his disreputable wife. These are bad dudes. This couple.
Yeah, Ahab and Jezebel, right? His lovely wife Jezebel, who gets a very bad press, and certainly depicted in the Bible in a very negative light. So Ahab is the ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, right? At this point, the united monarchy has split apart. We're now a couple generations into having Judah, the kingdom in the south, and Israel, the kingdom of the north. So Elijah is in the northern kingdom, and Ahab is the king of that territory. And Ahab is a fairly successful ruler in terms of prosperity, in terms of alliances with neighboring powers. He marries Jezebel, who's the daughter of a priest north of Israel, what we would call Lebanon today. Then it's called the kingdom of Tyre, the kingdom of Sidon. So Jezebel comes to the land of Israel, to the northern kingdom, married to Ahab, and she tries to bring along with her the worship of Baal, right, of the Canaanite god. Now, Israelites were attracted to Canaanite gods before that, but Jezebel really wants to plant Baal in the center of Israelite life. And from her point of view, you might say she's bringing culture. She's bringing the sophisticated culture of that kingdom of Sidon, the kingdom of Tyre. She brings priests along with her, and she wants to begin a serious cult of devoted to Baal. Some Israelites are attracted to that. Elijah's whole career is devoted to defeating Baal. He's the champion of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. He's the zealot fighting for monotheism, and he totally rejects any idolatrous worship or any prayers, any rituals offered to Baal. Ahab himself seems torn. He's in love with Jezebel, and he agrees to build her places of worship, and he himself seems to be involved in the worship of Baal, and yet he's also still trying to worship the true God, the one God, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And as we'll see very soon in the great contest on Mount Carmel, Elijah really says to the Israelites, why do you keep hopping between two branches? He compares Israel to a bird that can't settle down on one branch or another. If you believe in Baal, worship Baal. If you believe in Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, worship Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Elijah demands that the Israelites make a choice. He's already made his choice. And Jezebel is there as the wicked proponent of the false god.
You know, it's interesting. After King David and starting with Saul, then David, then Solomon, then we have a bunch of names of kings that most people can't remember at all. But these two folks, Ahab and Jezebel, somehow come into culture, popular culture, so that, you know, Herman Melville named the ship captain Ahab, and Jezebel is actually, I guess, a kind of adjective or a noun in English for a wicked woman. You say she's a real Jezebel, and all those other kings have fallen out, but these two kings you remember. Maybe because Elijah's history is wrapped up with them in some ways.
Yes, I'm sure, right. Jezebel is wicked because she's trying to defeat Elijah, and eventually she's trying to kill Elijah. And the relationship between Ahab and Elijah is so interesting. Elijah shows a certain amount of respect for the king, but he also really condemns him to death eventually. And in fact, it's interesting you mentioned Ahab and Melville, right? When people hear the name Ahab, they don't think immediately of the Book of Kings. Right. They don't think of Elijah. If you ask a typical American, even an American Jew, who was Ahab, they'll remember Moby Dick. And of course, you know, Ahab and Moby Dick doesn't seem to have anything to do with Ahab in the Bible. And yet, as you say, Melville picked Ahab intentionally. Melville was very deeply familiar, very well versed in the Bible. So the question is, why Ahab? Does Elijah appear at all? It turns out in Moby Dick, the night before the sailors are going to go off with Ahab, searching once again for Moby Dick, the sailors are terrified because they know Ahab is somewhat mad already. And a lot of them are hesitant to take the voyage. They go to an inn, they start drinking, and an old man comes up to them and says, "Watch out for this Ahab." It turns out, who is that old man? His name is Eli. So Melville himself is very much aware of Elijah, and Ahab, and
very nice. Yeah. So I want to turn to the phenomenally amazing encounter between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. To me, this is perhaps the most dramatic, even theatrical event in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it's stage managed by Elijah for full dramatic effect. So share with people what happens in this particular story.
Yeah, so Elijah has had part of his biblical career already. He performs certain miracles. He actually brings back to life a child who has died, and that's the first time in the whole Bible that we hear of anyone reviving someone who's died. Elijah is the first to bring someone back to life, which is interesting because he then goes on to live forever, according to tradition. So at the beginning of his career, he's already involved in something, overcoming death, you could say. But Elijah's main goal is to rid Israel of the worship of Baal. And he finally, tells Ahab, it's time to have a contest. And as you say, very dramatically, very theatrically, he arranges a contest on Mount Carmel, that beautiful, imposing mountain, what we would call Haifa today. And somewhere around Mount Carmel, there are different suggestions as to exactly where, but obviously near the Mediterranean coast, Elijah instructs Ahab to have all of the prophets of Baal assemble, 450 prophets of Baal, all of them connected with Jezebel, versus Elijah. Elijah will stand for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, for the God of Israel, and the prophets of Baal are obviously committed to Baal. And Elijah says, let's have a contest. Let's see who can bring down fire from their God in heaven. He says, we're going to have a sacrifice. The prophets of Baal sacrifice a bull, and Elijah sacrifices a bull, and the bull is on the altar. But Elijah says, we're going to see who can call down fire from heaven to consume this sacrifice. And as you say, kind of theatrically, dramatically, Elijah says, you can go first. Robert Alter, in his beautiful translation of the Bible, says in a note, this is kind of like in tennis. You let someone else serve first.
Yeah.
And the prophets of Baal begin dancing, begin praying and calling out to Baal to manifest by bringing fire down. But they're not successful. After a few hours, Elijah says, well, maybe your God is sleeping, or maybe he's off on a journey, or maybe he's relieving himself. The Hebrew is hard to translate there, and it may be that kind of scatological reference. But Elijah says, call a little louder. Maybe you can wake him up. And the prophets go into a frenzy. They begin to gash themselves and dance wildly, but still no effect, no result, no fire. And then Elijah steps forward, and to make it more dramatic, he pours water on his altar, on his sacrifice, and water all around the altar. But he prays to God very briefly, and fire comes down from heaven. And so Elijah seems to have won the contest, and the people are won over. Elijah seems to have brought the people back to the worship of the true God, because they say, also very dramatically, Hashem hu ha-Elohim. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the God. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the true God. They say it twice. Right? And that line, Hashem hu ha-Elohim, becomes enshrined at one of the most dramatic moments in the whole Jewish liturgy. Here we have, as you said, one of the most dramatic moments in the whole Hebrew Bible. And what the people proclaim, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the true God, becomes the line that's chanted at the very, very end of Yom Kippur, at the end of Ne'ilah, where it's chanted not twice, as the Israelites did it, but 7 times. So that great victory for the God of Israel over the false gods becomes part of our annual prayers.
Yeah, it's an amazing moment. And you would think right then that, Elijah's on a roll. I mean, he's won, but things don't turn out so great. And he ends up having to get out of town. And because Ahab and Jezebel are out to get him. And this leads him to a kind of period of, I guess you'd call it depression.
Yes, Elijah is such a human character. This is true, of course, of many biblical heroes in the Tanakh, but Elijah really reaches the heights and then the depths. And it's exactly here at his most triumphant moment, right? He's brought down the fire and he's convinced Ahab and the people of the truth of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And in fact, it says that Elijah is so ecstatic that he runs ahead of Ahab's chariot. all the way from Mount Carmel to Ahab's winter palace, probably about 20 miles, 17 or 20 miles, you could say. And Elijah thinks that he has won, but Ahab tells Jezebel what's happened, and Jezebel immediately threatens Elijah's life. He says, tomorrow you're going to be like one of those prophets of Baal, all of whom are killed after the victory, after Elijah's victory. So as you say, Elijah has to leave town. He flees from the whole northern kingdom. He goes south to Beersheba. So he's out of the jurisdiction of Ahab and Jezebel. But as you say, he falls into a deep depression. Here he thinks he has brought the people back to God, but Jezebel is out to kill him. And he realizes that this is not a permanent victory over Baal. So he really seems to feel something of a death wish. He really says to God, just, take my life. I'm all alone. The people are still blind to the truth of Yud He Vav He. And he's just given up. It really seems that he wants God to end his life. But Elijah then is drawn further south into the Sinai desert, and he makes it all the way to Horeb, to Mount Sinai, which obviously is an imitation of Moses. And there are a lot of parallels between Moses and Elijah. As Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, Elijah journeys 40 days and 40 nights to get to Sinai, to get to Horeb. And there he has an encounter with God, and God basically says to him a wonderful line. And there are a series of great dramatic lines in those 7 chapters. This is one of them. God says, Malachafo Eliyahu. What are you doing here? What are you doing here running off to the desert? You should be with the people. You should be with your people. Don't give up. And Elijah says, Kano kineti. It's the only time in the Bible, except for one other occasion, where you have that doubling of the verb, I am zealous, I am zealous. I am extremely zealous. Elijah proclaims his zealotry. He says, look, I've been fighting for you. I've been fighting for the truth, and the people are destroying altars. The people are worshiping Baal. They want to kill me. And then God, in God's own tremendously dramatic way, God manifests the power of the Almighty, first in wind, and then with an earthquake, and then with fire. But the Bible is careful to say God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. And finally, there comes the ultimate manifestation of God. How? Kol dimama daka. It's usually translated a still small voice. But that's really a mistranslation. It's really a sound of sheer stillness. In other words, after these wild, noisy phenomena, the wind and the earthquake and the fire, comes a moment of silence. Elijah hears the silence. You could say this is the sound of silence. Some people say that Simon and Garfunkel got their song from this line in the Hebrew Bible. But in any case, it's very close. Elijah senses the silence after the storm. Dimama is really the stillness that comes after the storm. And Elijah realizes God is to be found in the silence. It's really a beautiful hint at meditation, the power of meditation and the power of silence after all of the words we might invent or repeat. So it's there that God manifests to Elijah, and then God asks again, Malachafo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Maybe Elijah has learned something. Maybe Elijah has finally gotten a message, but Elijah just repeats what he said before, Kano kineti, I'm very zealous, they're all out to get me. He's very much of a loner, and he feels persecuted for good reason. And at that point, God says to him, basically, go and anoint your successor. Maybe God is going to respond to Elijah and punish the people. There's an indication of that. But God basically says, at least this is how the rabbis read it, you're fired. He says, go anoint Elisha tachtecha, in your place. Yeah. But the rabbis say, what does that mean? In your place? I don't want your prophesying anymore. You're complaining too much. You're giving up at this vital point. So whether or not it's that Elijah is fired, Elijah then goes and anoints his successor, and then the story continues.
So there's much more we could talk about the Elijah story in the Bible, but I want to move on to other aspects that you discuss. But before we leave the biblical Elijah, we have to talk about his very dramatic death. And that leads to this notion that you explore in the book, that Elijah is one of the few people that never died, that went to heaven, but without having to go through death. There's a kind of, the Talmud has an odd list of like 7 or either 2 different versions of it, of people that didn't die and went up to heaven. And Elijah is an eternal figure. So say something about his death. The way he dies is pretty dramatic, and you can see it on the cover of your book. There's an engraving there that's beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Maybe this is even more dramatic than Mount Carmel because of what it leads to. So Elijah is with Elisha, with his disciple who will be his successor, and it almost seems like he goes on a farewell tour. Elijah and Elisha go around to various cities, and basically to say goodbye. And at that point, Elijah and Elisha are on their own. They're right by the Jordan River. And it says a chariot of fire came and took Elijah up to heaven. Now, it's not clear what that means exactly. Does that mean this was a death, a spectacular death, that he's taken to God? When we die, we go to God, but Elijah went in such an amazing way. Maybe it means that he died spectacularly, or maybe it means he escaped death entirely. He went to heaven to be with God without dying, as you were saying. Mm-hmm. There's only one other person in the Hebrew Bible about whom something similar is said, and that's Enoch. Remember, at the beginning of Genesis, it says Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer, ki lakachoto Elohim, because God took him. Does that mean he took him from life and he died, or does that mean he took him before he died and he's up there in heaven? So Enoch is up in heaven according to later tradition. Elijah is up in heaven, but Elijah is very different because he doesn't stay in heaven. So whether or not the Bible intends to say that he didn't die, that's how it's interpreted in later Jewish tradition, and not only in Jewish tradition, but in Christian tradition and Islamic tradition. Elijah is seen as up there in heaven, but he doesn't stay in heaven. He comes down to help those in need, as we'll see. And that whole notion that he didn't die is based on that ambiguous and colorful description of the chariot of fire taking him off.
So that's what you just said is a very nice transition to another chapter in the book in which you look at the way the rabbis present Elijah. And I guess you would say, or you do say, that the rabbis reinterpret the Elijah that's full of zealotry. It becomes a different kind of character in the hands of the Talmud and the Midrashic literature. You have two phrases that I like very much. One is you call him a shapeshifter, and in another you said he becomes the champion of the Jews in a risky world. Those two ideas. And that sounds very different from the biblical Elijah. It's a different incarnation.
Yeah, this I think is the most striking thing about Elijah, how different he is in the Bible and in all later Jewish tradition. Now we have to be careful here because in the Bible too, Elijah has a compassionate side. He brings back this little boy to life. He's trying to bring rain back after the long drought. He imposes a drought, but then he ends the drought. He cares for Israel, but he's so fanatically committed to monotheism that he comes across in a very harsh way in some of the biblical narrative. And the rabbis seem to, I think, consciously reshape him, reimagine him. It's as if Elijah is too harsh, and the rabbis are trying to help him move to a new state. You could say he changes from being a zealot to a master of compassion. One writer has even called him a Jewish bodhisattva. Of course, in Buddhism, the bodhisattva is one who could attain nirvana, but he gives up on nirvana so that he can come down and help humanity. And you might say Elijah is brought up to heaven, but he doesn't remain in heaven. He comes down to help. So he's there to help people and to teach people. He's really a super rabbi. He's something between an angel and a rabbi. He's involved with the rabbis in discussion. Some of the rabbis have what's called Gilui Eliyahu, a revelation of Elijah. So he might show up and show a rabbi a new way to read a verse. He might be involved in the Beit Midrash. He'll sometimes show up at a house of study and give an insight. Or what he does sometimes is to report what's happening in heaven. Right? Elijah is allowed, not only is he in heaven, he's in the academy of heaven. He's in the Yeshiva Shamala. He's right there where God is teaching Torah to the souls of the departed. And Elijah moves back and forth. He's always in between. One writer has called him a virtuoso of the in-between. So he's reporting to the rabbis what's going on in the heavenly academy, and he reports to the heavenly academy what's troubling the rabbis. So he turns from a zealot to someone who's deeply learned, and more important, someone who's the source of inspiration. Elijah really becomes an embodiment of Ruach HaKodesh, of the Holy Spirit. Right? We said before that even in the Bible, he's compared to the wind, or he can be taken by the wind anywhere. Now in rabbinic texts, the rabbinic tradition, you could say he cultivates his own deep spirituality. He embodies Ruach HaKodesh. He's the way that rabbis can be inspired. And eventually he is the inspiration for the early masters of the Kabbalah.
And it's interesting that it's amazing sometimes in the rabbinic sources where you'll have one of the rabbis say, well, I bumped into Elijah and this is what he told me. I mean, that kind of gilui is pretty astounding.
Yeah, and you wonder, what does that mean exactly? Does it mean that the rabbi met Elijah, or does it mean he had some deep internal experience where he was inspired or he had an insight and he attributes that to Elijah? You know, I think we would say from a modern perspective, that's much more likely. In the Talmud, it seems that they're actually meeting Elijah, but in the later mystical texts, you really get an indication that this is an internal contemplative experience and that Elijah is really somehow a spark of inspiration that can manifest to anyone if the person is devout, if the person is sincerely searching for that.
You know, one of his appearances, you didn't tell this story in the book, but one of his appearances has a very big influence on Rabbi Akiva. Because when Rabbi Akiva and his wife are suffering in poverty and all that, a poor man shows up at the door, and that's Elijah in the shape of a poor man. And when they finish talking with him, they decide he better go off and become a rabbi. I mean, it's kind of the inspiration of that moment changes Akiva's life in one of the versions of the early life of Akiva. And I like this, the shape-shifting thing, that he can appear, he appears in one case, he wants to rescue one of the rabbis.
Let me retell that. Yes, you said that the shapeshifter is really such a beautiful aspect of him. He can impersonate different people. He can show up in different forms. He can be a horseman, an Arab, a Persian, a slave, a royal minister, a Roman dignitary, and one time he actually seems to turn into someone very disreputable. What happened was Rabbi Meir was in trouble because Rabbi Meir rescued his sister-in-law from a Roman brothel. Rabbi Meir's sister-in-law had been condemned to live in a brothel, and Rabbi Meir rescued her. And because of that, the Romans are out to get Rabbi Meir. They actually put his picture on the gates of the city and want to capture him. So the Roman soldiers are about to apprehend Rabbi Meir. Elijah shows up as a prostitute. And Elijah embraces Rabbi Meir And the Romans say, that can't be Rabbi Meir. He would never do that. And that's how he saves Rabbi Meir.
Yeah, that's a great story.
So he's,
Really
he's
great.
able to take on different forms. His identity is very malleable. And that's
and when Jews are in trouble, he appears. That's part of the beauty of it. And he does have some of that in the Bible, but not like that. You know, he tries. Well, we won't go. I don't want to go back to biblical stuff because I want to be sure to get into Kabbalah. So, as probably a number of people on this call know, Daniel Matt is one of the world's great scholars of Kabbalah, and his translation and commentary on the Zohar is without doubt one of the greatest accomplishments of Jewish scholarship of the past number of decades. So it was not surprising to me to find that you have a chapter on Elijah in Kabbalah. And I guess it picks up on the way that the rabbis represent Elijah, but it goes in other directions as well. So perhaps you could say a bit about how Kabbalah.
Right. You know, Elijah is interesting because he really seems to span two extremes. One is a very secretive figure, this loner, you know, this ultimate intense devotee. On the other hand, he becomes such a popular figure, right? He's someone that anyone can reach out to that will help someone in need. So he's both popular and esoteric. And I mention that because Kabbalah, of course, is the secret teachings of Judaism. So what role does Elijah have there? You know, the great scholar of rabbinics, Louis Ginzberg, who wrote, you know, among other things, the Legends of the Jews. At one point, Ginzberg says the following: what Moses was to the Torah, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but what he's saying is that Elijah, as the embodiment of Ruach HaKodesh, as the embodiment of the Holy Spirit, he was the person who inspired the mystics. And we find that of the people who were considered the earliest Kabbalists, these are people living the end of the 12th century, the beginning of the 13th century in Spain and Provence. It is told about them, about a number of them, that they had what we call Gilui Eliyahu. We mentioned that phrase, a revelation of Elijah. In other words, you might wonder, how did the Kabbalists come up with these new radical ideas? How can they say that God is half male and half female? How can they invent new names for God like infinity or nothingness? And according to Kabbalistic tradition, the reason the Kabbalists were able to do that is because they had an encounter with Elijah. Again, what does this mean? Does it mean they met Elijah? Elijah came down from heaven, they met him? Or does it mean that these mystics went deep within themselves and contacted some source of inspiration, and they pictured that as Elijah? They felt that was Elijah.
And is this related to the fact that he is viewed as a person, as a being that never died? It's a kind of angelic aspect of Elijah almost.
Right, it's as if he's available, right? He's not stuck there in heaven, he's available, he's a mediator. And I think Gershom Scholem says a very helpful thing here, that why do the Kabbalists attribute their innovations to Elijah? If you come up with a new mystical idea, why attribute it to Elijah? What Scholem says is that if an idea was very radical, and if it could have aroused opposition or suspicion, by saying that it came from Elijah, this is a way to say, you think this is new? No, this is part of the tradition. The most revered figure, one of the most revered figures in our tradition, has delivered this to me. So somehow, you know, invoking Elijah, attributing it to Elijah, is giving it the stamp of approval, the stamp of authority. And I think that explains to a certain extent why Elijah becomes so central in the Kabbalah. These new teachings, what the Zohar calls new ancient teachings. They're brand new in a way, but they're also recovering some ancient stream of thought. And Elijah is the one who mediates, who conveys that.
So before we take some of the questions that people have put out, I want to be sure to turn to something that many people on the call may be familiar with, and you mentioned it earlier on when you talked about the Passover Seder. There are rituals that Elijah gets associated with, and you write about that in the book, and also about how or in what way we can determine how Elijah comes to be associated with these particular rituals. So why don't you turn to that?
Yeah, I think, for most of the people here, for most of the people in the Jewish world, when you think of Elijah, you can't help but think of the Seder. Right? Elijah, and really in two ways, right? There's a cup for Elijah on the Seder table, and then the door, of course, is open for Elijah late in the Seder. So how did that begin? It's obviously not in the Bible. It's also not in the Talmud. These are really later customs, medieval customs. We don't know how they began. Once they began, you have rabbis trying to explain them, really after the fact. But it's interesting how they develop. We know a little bit about that. Why is Elijah associated with the Seder, with Pesach? Passover is celebrating the redemption of Israel from Egyptian slavery, and Passover is seen as the time when the final redemption will come. So the Messianic era will begin on Pesach, according to rabbinic tradition. And since Elijah is the one who will announce the Messiah, right? We haven't talked about that, but to go back just for a second to the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Malachi includes a line where God says, I am bringing Elijah before the day of Hashem, before the day of Yud He Vav He. The rabbis take that to mean that Elijah will announce the coming of the Mashiach. So if the Mashiach is going to come on Pesach, it makes sense that Elijah would be there on Pesach to announce his arrival. So that's probably the basic reason why Elijah is connected with Pesach. But why the opening the door? Why the cup of wine? It seems to go back to an idea that the first night of Pesach is called Leil Shimurim, a night of watching, or a night of watches, or a night of protection. Because it was seen to be a time of protection, Jews had a custom to leave their doors open. Nothing to do with Elijah at first, just you leave your door open because you're not scared. That night the Jewish people are protected, the door can be opened. And gradually there was the notion, well, we're leaving the door open. One rabbi says in the 11th century, we leave the door open, not so that Elijah can come in, so that we can go out. Because if Elijah comes to announce the Messiah, we don't want to miss it. We want to be able to go out right away. We'll leave the door open for that. But then the notion was, well, look, if Elijah's going to come, maybe he needs a cup of wine. Everybody at the Seder has to drink 4 cups of wine, so we should have a cup of wine for Elijah. So you have the wine and you have the door, and gradually this becomes what we have experienced. It's interesting. The name Elijah does not appear anywhere in the Haggadah. Right? It's traditional to pour the cup. It's traditional to open the door, but Elijah isn't mentioned there.
And I have to tell you that a story in my own family, that my mother, when she was a little girl, since she was the youngest of many siblings, one Pesach Eve, she was told to open the door to Elijah. And when she opened the door, there was a guy standing there about to knock on the door, which completely shocked her. And it turned out he was a different kind of Elijah. He was the guy from Western Union delivering a telegram from relatives saying, Chag Sameach, happy Passover.
Bringing a message.
Bringing a message.
Yeah.
So
let me say one thing. In some communities, there was a custom for someone to dress up as Elijah and barge in right at that moment, to act out dramatically his arrival.
Yeah, that was not the case, but might have been. Less familiar to people, I would guess, is the notion of the seat of Elijah that is part of the ritual of circumcision, of the Brit Milah. So perhaps you could explain.
Yeah, that's fascinating. According to tradition, Elijah is present at every ritual circumcision, and a special chair is put there, the Kisei Eliyahu. The chair is left empty for Elijah. So how did this begin? This is also obviously not in the Bible and also not in the Talmud. this is mentioned for the first time in a relatively late midrash called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, chapters of Rabbi Eliezer. It's not invented there because in that text they refer to this custom, but they explain, they give a reason why Elijah would show up at the breach, at the covenant of circumcision. This is because Elijah is so zealous that according to this midrash, during the reign of Ahab, the Israelites stopped enacting circumcision. And Elijah brought it back. Elijah devoted himself to restoring circumcision to the people of Israel. But specifically, you remember that line where God says to Elijah on Mount Sinai, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah says, "Kano kineti," I've been so zealous. Well, according to this midrash, God says to Elijah, "You're always zealous. You were zealous back then and you're zealous now. I am going to make you show up at every circumcision so you'll see the Israelites are not rejecting the covenant. They're committed to the covenant." So it seems to be almost a punishment, although some interpreters see it as a reward. Elijah shows up at the circumcision to prove to himself that the people are committed and that maybe he has been successful despite his moments of doubt and depression.
So the third ritual where Elijah has a significant presence is at the end of Shabbat, the Havdalah ceremony. And it's customary to sing the Eliyahu Hanavi song that many people will know. And there are other associations. Why is Elijah showing up at the end of Shabbat?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Many people have memories of Havdalah, chanting Havdalah, the prayer for marking the conclusion of Shabbat, and then singing the song for Eliyahu. So why bring Eliyahu here? Okay, circumcision, we understand. The Seder, we understand. It's redemption. What does Elijah have to do with Shabbat? Well, you might say that here too, Elijah is going to bring the Mashiach, is going to announce the Mashiach, and Shabbat is really considered a taste of the Mashiach. Me'en olam haba, something like the world to come. So you could say it's fitting that Elijah is there, but there's something more specific involved here, a beautiful, somewhat humorous story. And that goes back to a discussion in the Talmud. When will the Messiah come? On what day will the Messiah come? Or when will Elijah come? And the rabbis say we have a tradition that Elijah will not show up on Friday. In other words, he won't come to announce the Mashiach on Friday. Why? Because people are too busy getting ready for Shabbat. Now that sounds a little strange. If the Messiah is going to come, you'd think you'd put everything aside and greet the Messiah. But no, the rabbis very typically say, you know what? Let's keep Shabbat. Let's prepare for Shabbat. And the Mashiach will come. So in any case, it's a tradition that Elijah will not come on Friday. Well, that means the Mashiach won't come on Shabbat because the Mashiach comes one day after Elijah announces him, according to one account. Okay, Elijah won't come on Friday, but maybe Elijah can come on Shabbat, and that way Mashiach would come, let's say Shabbat or Sunday. So the question is, can Elijah come on Shabbat? Now, what's the problem? The problem is traveling on Shabbat. Can Elijah travel from heaven to Yerushalayim on Shabbat? Now, you're only allowed to travel how far on Shabbat? 2,000 cubits. That's about half a mile. So it's a little more than half a mile from heaven to Jerusalem. So can Elijah travel? It would seem not, but wait a minute. What about if you're traveling above ground? Like the Talmud actually has a discussion, not about flying, but about a ship. If you're on an ocean voyage, the ship is at least a certain amount, technically 10 handbreadths, about 2.5 feet. If the ship remains 2.5 feet above the seabed, then maybe traveling is allowed. So it's not, and that would mean Elijah, who's obviously going to be more than 2.5 feet above the ground, maybe he can fly, but the Talmud doesn't decide the matter. The Talmud doesn't decide whether you can be above the ground and travel for a distance. So we don't know if Elijah can come on Shabbat. Since we don't know, we assume he won't come on Shabbat, which means Saturday night, the second Shabbat is done. What do we say? No more excuses. We want you to come. And that apparently is, according to a number of sources, that's why Elijah is there on Havdalah, and that's why we sing something for him.
That's very nice. So Lauren, why don't we take a few questions from the from the folks?
Sure, we have quite a few coming in. You did address Elijah's appearance at the Seder, but there's one question about why he appears at the end rather than the dinner, rather than the beginning, which is when an invited guest would be expected to show up.
Yeah, originally it probably was at the beginning, and it may be connected with that beautiful line at the beginning of the Seder, Kol dichsin yetev yechul. Anyone who's hungry, let him come and eat. So that's too also why you open the door. You open the door not for Elijah, you open the door so that if someone's hungry, they'll come. But since you're expecting a guest, maybe we want the ultimate guest. So there was the idea that you would open the door at the beginning, and some people connected with Elijah. Eventually, that opening the door was moved to later in the Seder, where we have the dramatic line there. Also, Shafoch Hamatcha, pour out your wrath upon the heathens who are attacking Israel. At that moment, the welcoming of Elijah was moved there. The door is opened, and Elijah is welcomed.
And a question about whether Elijah went up in a whirlwind or a chariot.
Yeah, really both. He went up the Se'ara in a whirlwind, but he's carried through the whirlwind on this chariot of fire with horses of fire. So you could say both.
Okay. And a question about where in the Bible are these 7 chapters about Elijah?
Okay.
I should have said that at the beginning.
It actually straddles the first and the second book of Kings. It begins on 1 Kings chapter 17, and then not every chapter, but most of the chapters from there till the end of the book of Kings, and then the first couple chapters of Kings 2. Kings 1 and Kings 2, that's really an artificial separation, as you can see from the story. So it's in the book of Kings.
And can you comment about how Elijah and Elisha became templates for Jesus in the work of the gospel writers?
Yeah, Elijah's role in Judaism, is very prominent, but Elijah also figures in Christianity and Islam. And in fact, he has a role in the New Testament. Now you could imagine this, because if Elijah is going to bring the Mashiach, then he should be involved in recognizing Jesus or bringing Jesus. And according to the New Testament, according to Jesus himself, John the Baptist is Elijah. I wouldn't say an incarnation of Elijah, that Elijah appears, as we said before, he's a shapeshifter, he can become different people. According to this passage in the New Testament, it seems that Elijah turns into John the Baptist so that he will be the one to anoint Christ. But actually, it's even more interesting than that, because not only is John the Baptist linked with Elijah, Jesus himself is linked with Elijah. And at one point in the New Testament, Jesus asks his disciple, "Who do people say that I am?" And his disciples say, some of them say you're Elijah. And in fact, Jesus might have thought of himself as a prophet. It's very likely he thought of himself as a prophet even before he thought of himself as the Messiah. So Jesus may have felt that he was Elijah. And then eventually, when Jesus is promoted from prophet to Messiah, it makes more sense for John the Baptist to be Elijah. So he figures with both of those important Christian figures.
And can you say something about how Elijah is perceived and discussed by modern Jewish thinkers, i.e. Buber, Rosenzweig, Heschel, et al.?
Yeah, I don't think he figures that prominently in Buber. Buber actually wrote a play about Elijah, dramatizing more the biblical narrative. From what I know, he's not central there. Yeah, I would just leave it at that.
Okay. As a shapeshifter who took on different roles, does Elijah have a connection to Theodore, or the green man from the Sufi tradition?
Yes, Al-Khidr is the name for the Elijah figure in Islam. Al-Khidr literally means the green one. And this appears in many cultures, but in Islam, the green one, Al-Khidr, is sometimes identified with Elijah. Sometimes he's even called Elijah. And in fact, some Jews in Muslim countries refer to Elijah as Al-Khidr. So they seem to be either cousins or brothers or one and the same. There's one beautiful passage where it says that Elijah meets Al-Khidr in Jerusalem, and they go together on pilgrimage to Mecca. So Al-Khidr and Elijah are closely connected and sometimes identified. I would say in the Quran has one passage where it doesn't name Al-Khidr or Elijah, but it refers to someone as the servant of Allah. And Islamic tradition identifies that servant of Allah as Al-Khidr, the green one. And as I say, for many Muslims, they are one and the same, Al-Khidr and Elijah. Yeah, there are shrines, for example, on Mount Carmel, we have something called the Cave of Elijah. For Muslims, it's the Cave of Al-Khidr. So the same place and the same devotion with two different names.
And what did the Rambam make of Elijah?
Yeah, the Rambam doesn't really give Elijah a major role. The Rambam seems to avoid linking Elijah directly with announcing the Mashiach. He alludes to it, but he doesn't make much of it. I think for someone who's a rationalist like Elijah, it seems more that he's a figure of the past and not of the present. Maimonides honors him greatly, and he sees him as a very important link in the tradition. But you wouldn't imagine Maimonides having a Gilui Eliyahu, a revelation of Elijah. So he respects him, but doesn't emphasize his mystical role.
Isn't there a large collection of tales about Elijah in the marketplace?
You have Elijah showing up in the marketplace. That's already in the Talmud. He'll meet certain rabbis in the house of study, other rabbis on the road, and sometimes in the marketplace. And then in later folk tradition, right, there's a huge number of folk tales about Elijah. In fact, there's a center in Israel for collecting all of the folk tales of Judaism. Where is it located? On Mount Carmel. Okay, in Haifa. It happens to be at the University of Haifa. But there are more tales about Elijah there than about anyone else, maybe by a factor of 5 or 10.
Wow.
There are more folk. He is the hero of Jewish folklore. He's the most popular figure in all of Jewish folklore, more than Abraham or David or Moses. There are more tales about him. Why? Because he's available, because people call out to him in need.
Will you talk about their tradition that he adjudicates disputes? This function doesn't seem like one he'd take on so black and white approach as a zealot.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is very important. I'm glad you raised that. This transformation of Elijah, right, from a zealot to a compassionate hero. That's really the main thing that I talk about toward the end of the book. I would really call it a tikkun. It's a kind of repair, a kind of mending, in which Elijah is transformed from the harsh zealot to this Jewish bodhisattva. Now you might say the rabbis are doing that because they can't accept the harshness of Elijah. They want him to change. But I would say a little more poetically, a little more imaginatively, that Elijah himself wants this tikkun. Elijah wants to become something more complete or more whole or more harmonious than he was. So this transformation is something done to him and something you could say done by him. About the adjudicating cases, what that comes down to is when the Messiah comes, Elijah will reveal to us things that we didn't know, and that will help us solve various problems. What you said about the black and white is very significant. On Mount Carmel, right, it's totally black and white. You're either for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh or you're for the false god. Later, Elijah is the one of the people who says, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Both this and that is part of God's revelation. I don't mean idolatry. I mean different views, conflicting views. So Elijah changes from someone who insists on one view to someone who appreciates the variety, the multiplicity of interpretations of the Torah. He celebrates that. He delivers that.
Can you explain the connection of Elijah's fiery chariot and mystical practice?
It's interesting. You have another chariot in the Bible, right? Many chariots, but another spiritual chariot, and that, of course, is Ezekiel's vision of the chariot, right? The first chapter of Ezekiel, and this is a few hundred years after Elijah. Ezekiel has a vision in Babylon where he sees the heavens open and he describes a divine chariot. Some people claim it's a UFO, but it seems to be a chariot with wheels, with angelic wheels, and a divine figure is seated on that chariot throne. It's really a chariot throne. So you have the chariot of Ezekiel and you have the chariot of Elijah. The chariot of Ezekiel, you could say, gives birth to Jewish mysticism. That is the beginning of Jewish mysticism, according to Kabbalah. And Elijah is the one who conveys Kabbalah. So there is a link between the two. And one other thing that comes to mind, when Elijah and Elisha are walking along, right before Elijah is taken to heaven, it says the two of them were walking along, and the rabbis say, well, what were they discussing? They must have been discussing words of Torah. It says, you know what they were discussing? They were discussing the chariot of Ezekiel. So they're talking about the chariot of Ezekiel. What happens? A chariot appears. So the two chariots are linked.
This seems like a good question to end on. If you have an answer to it, what lessons can we take from the prophet Elijah as to how we should live today, the choices we should make?
What can we learn from Elijah? I would say to me, and this is how I end the book, there's something that Hasidism calls Bechinat Eliyahu, an aspect of Elijah or a quality of Elijah or spark of Elijah. And according to Hasidism, each one of us has a spark of Elijah. So we can call on that. What does that mean? We can be inspired. If we quiet our busy mind, if we meditate, we can let that inner source of inspiration come to light. And that is a way, really what I hint at in the book. The reason I called the book Becoming Elijah is because of two things. One, that Elijah changes over the course of history from the zealot to the compassionate hero, but also that each one of us can, in a sense, become Elijah if we actualize that potential, that spiritual potential within us.
Thank you. Any final words from either of you before we say goodnight?
No, I think I'm glad you got to say the last thing that you did, Daniel, because I was going to ask you to talk about the title of the book. So I'm glad it was an answer to the question. That's, I think, a really nice place to end.
Well, thank you both very much.
It's been a pleasure. It's been terrific.
And thank you to everyone for joining us. Take care.
Shalom.
So long.
Bye-bye.
Bye.